I spent 3 years paying his rent, buying his clothes, and building his dreams from the ground up, only for him to stand on national television and call me a placeholder before popping my balloon in front of millions. The bright studio lights of the Pop the Balloon set felt like heat lamps against my skin, making every drop of sweat feel like a cold needle. I stood in the dead center of that stage, my legs trembling beneath my favorite dress. The one Mark always said made me look like a dream. But as I looked across the 10-foot gap at him, I realized I was living in a nightmare. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears, rhythmic thumping that drowned out the muffled whispers of the audience. I was clutching a red balloon that suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, a leaden anchor tethering me to a man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Mark stood there, bathed in the neon glow of the production, looking more handsome than the day I met him 3 years ago. His jaw was set, his hair perfectly styled with the expensive product I had bought him just last week. But his eyes, those eyes that used to look at me with warmth over morning coffee, were different. They were shards of glass, cold and distant. It was a look of total detachment, as if he didn't even recognize the woman who had spent the last 36 months building his life from the ground up. This was the man who slept in a bed I paid for, who drove a car I insured, and who had spent the last hour on camera telling a room full of strangers that he was looking for the one. I had come here to be the ultimate anniversary surprise. I thought this was going to be our forever moment, a beautiful story we would tell our children about how I walked onto a dating show set just to remind him that he was already chosen. I had the ring box tucked into my palm, my thumb tracing the velvet edge, waiting for the host to give me the cue to reveal our life together. But the second the host announced my name, the oxygen left the room. The air shifted from electric excitement to a thick, suffocating tension that made it hard to breathe. I searched Mark's face, desperately waiting for that familiar, crooked smile to break through the mask of his coldness. I wanted him to laugh, to run over and hug me, to tell the producers that this was all a big misunderstanding because he already had everything he needed right here. Instead, he just stared at the floor. He shifted his weight from side to side, his shoulders hunched like a man trapped in a corner, looking for the nearest exit. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He wouldn't acknowledge the 3 years of late-night talks, the shared dreams, or the way I held him when he had nothing. The silence of the crowd was deafening. In that agonizing stillness, a sharp, bitter realization sliced through my heart. I wasn't his guest of honor. I wasn't the love of his life being revealed to the world. I was his biggest secret, his greatest embarrassment, and a hurdle in his race toward internet fame. I looked at the cameras, their red lights blinking like predatory eyes, and then back at the man I thought I knew. He wasn't choosing me. He was calculating the cost of my presence against the value of his vanity. He was preparing to trade 3 years of my unwavering loyalty, my financial support, and my soul for 5 minutes of digital clout and a few thousand followers. I was standing there with my heart exposed, and he was holding a needle, ready to pop the only world I had left. The host leaned in, the microphone reflecting the harsh studio glare, and I knew the next few words would either save me or destroy me. Mark finally looked up, but he didn't look at me. He looked at the girl in the red dress standing in the next slot, and then he looked at the host with a smirk that told me everything I needed to know. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a placeholder. I was a chapter he was ready to burn so he could start a new story, and as he reached out toward my balloon, I realized that the woman who entered the studio was not the same woman who would be leaving it. My anniversary gift wasn't a ring, it was the clarity of seeing a monster for exactly what he was. The host leaned in, his eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger only a man looking for a viral moment possesses, and asked the question that shattered my entire world. "Mark, be honest with us. Is this your girlfriend?" The silence that followed didn't just fill the room, it suffocated it. It was a heavy, stagnant weight that felt like it lasted a lifetime, stretching every second into an eternity of agony. I stood there, frozen, my lungs paralyzed, waiting for Mark to say my name. I was waiting for him to laugh off the tension, to grab my hand, and to tell the world that I was the woman who had been his rock for 3 years. But the man standing across from me didn't look like the man I had kissed goodbye that morning. He finally looked up, but his gaze didn't land on me. He didn't look at my trembling hands or the tears pooling in my eyes. Instead, he looked directly into the camera lens, his face twisting into a smirk that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. With a movement that was terrifyingly steady and agonizingly slow, he reached out. There was no hesitation in his fingers, no tremor of guilt in his posture. He gripped the needle provided by the show, and before I could even gasp, he plunged it into my red balloon. The bang was deafening. It wasn't just the sound of rubber bursting, it was the sound of a 3-year foundation collapsing into dust. The noise echoed through the rafters of the studio, bouncing off the cold metal equipment and ringing in my ears like a funeral bell. "She's not my girlfriend," he said. His voice wasn't soft or apologetic. It was sharp, jagged, and cold, cutting through the air with more precision than the needle he had just used. He spoke with a casual cruelty that made the audience gasp. "She's just a placeholder who didn't know when to let go. I'm here for a real woman, not a shadow that follows me around. I'm here for a new beginning, not to be anchored to a past I've outgrown." I felt the blood drain from my face so quickly I thought I might faint. My skin went cold, and a numbness started in my fingertips and raced toward my heart. The term placeholder hit me harder than any physical blow could. It was a word designed to erase 3 years of my life. It turned every late night I spent working to pay his car note, every sacrifice I made for his career, and every "I love you" he whispered in the dark into a transactional lie. I wasn't his partner. I was just a seat warmer for the person he actually wanted. Most people think a relationship is built on love, but Mark didn't realize ours was built on a silent contract, and he just breached the final clause. Before I show you how I tore up the fine print and left him with nothing, hit that subscribe button and join the circle. You're going to want to be here for the moment the placeholder becomes the landlord. The studio audience began to murmur, a low, buzzing sound of shock and judgment that swirled around me like a storm. I could see the camera operators zooming in on my face, capturing every ounce of my humiliation for the world to see. I was no longer a person to them. I was a content moment, a tragic highlight reel for a dating show. I looked at Mark, desperate for even a shred of regret, but he was already gone. He didn't even look back at me. He didn't acknowledge the woman who was currently paying for the suit he was wearing. Instead, he turned his back on me with a chilling finality. He adjusted his jacket, flashed a confident grin at the crowd, and began walking toward the other side of the stage. He moved with a predatory grace toward a girl in a red dress, a stranger he had known for less than 20 minutes. He reached out and took her hand, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle, while I was left standing in the center of the spotlight, surrounded by nothing but scraps of popped rubber and the debris of broken promises. The girl in the red dress looked at me for a split second, a flash of pity in her eyes, before she turned her attention back to Mark's charm. I realized then that to Mark, people were just accessories. I had been the accessory that provided the money and the stability, and she was the accessory that provided the ego boost. I stood there, my feet glued to the floor, staring at the spot where he had stood just moments ago. The red balloon I had held so carefully was now just a shriveled piece of trash at my feet, a perfect metaphor for what he had done to my soul. I wanted to scream, to tell the audience that he was a fraud, that his confidence was funded by my bank account, and that his success was built on my labor. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, locked by the sheer weight of the betrayal. I watched him walk away, his shadow stretching across the stage, moving further and further into his new life, while I remained trapped in the wreckage of the old one. He had traded 3 years of loyalty for a moment of television drama, and as the host moved on to the next segment, I realized the world wasn't stopping for my heartbreak. The cameras were already focusing on Mark's new match, leaving me in the shadows of the stage, a placeholder that had finally been displaced. I walked off that neon-lit stage with the sound of Mark's laughter ringing in my ears, a hollow, mocking sound that seemed to bounce off the studio walls and follow me into the shadows. Every step I took felt like I was walking through deep water, my legs heavy and my mind reeling from the public execution of my dignity. By the time I reached the sanctuary of the dressing room, the heavy, suffocating blanket of sadness began to lift, replaced by something much more dangerous. A white-hot flame of absolute clarity. The tears that had been threatening to spill suddenly dried up, scorched away by a sudden, sharp understanding of the last 3 years. I sat down in front of the vanity mirror, staring at my reflection, but I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had been a silent architect of a man who didn't exist. I sat there and forced myself to remember. I remembered the grueling overtime shifts I pulled at the hospital, staying up until dawn just so I could make the down payment on the silver sedan Mark drove to the studio today. I remembered the day we moved into our apartment, the apartment I had to sign for a loan because his credit score was in the gutter. I had ruined my own debt-to-income ratio just to give him a luxury zip code to brag about. I remembered the countless times I dimmed my own light, hiding my promotions and my successes, because I was terrified that if I shone too brightly, he would feel small. I had spent 36 months shrinking myself so he could feel like a giant. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady now, and saw a notification that felt like a final slap in the face. Mark had already posted a selfie with the girl in the red dress. They were backstage, glowing under the filters, both of them smiling like they'd just won the lottery. The caption read, "Finally found the one. No more settling for placeholders." The word placeholder didn't hurt this time. It acted like a key turning in a lock. I realized in that moment that Mark never actually loved me. He loved the comfort I provided. He loved the designer clothes I bought for him, the organic groceries I stocked in the fridge, and the safety of a home he didn't have to work for. He thought he could keep the lifestyle I built while discarding the woman who built it. He truly believed he could walk out on the foundation and expect the house to keep standing. A cold, calm resolve settled over me. The shaking stopped. The heartbreak vanished, replaced by a strategic, icy focus. I looked at the ring box still sitting on the table, the ring I had bought with my own hard-earned money to celebrate a man who had just traded me for 5 minutes of fame. I realized that if I was truly just a placeholder, then the lease on his life had just expired. He wanted a show? He was about to get a grand finale he never saw coming. I looked at my reflection one last time and straightened my shoulders. Mark didn't realize that when you throw away the person who holds your entire world together, the world doesn't stay upright. It falls. And I was about to make sure it fell exactly where it belonged. It was time for the real owner of his life to take back every single thing that belonged to her. The placeholder was officially stepping down, and the landlord was taking over. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out of that dressing room. I didn't look back at the monitors showing his happy ending on stage. I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, calculating the cost of the locks I was about to change and the car I was about to reclaim. He wanted to play a game of pop the balloon, but he didn't realize I was the one who owned the air he was breathing. The tears were gone. The era of being a shadow was over. Now it was time for the light to come back on, and I was the one holding the switch. By the time the director yelled cut and the audience began to file out of the studio, the man known as Mark was officially a ghost in his own life. While he was busy backstage exchanging numbers with a stranger and soaking up the praise of production assistants, I was operating with the cold, surgical precision of a woman who had finally woken up. I didn't scream, I didn't send a single angry text, and I didn't make a scene. Instead, I sat in the quiet of my car and made 3 phone calls that would effectively delete his existence from my world. The first call was to a 24-hour locksmith. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremors that had shaken me on stage. I explained that I had an emergency and needed the locks on my high-rise apartment changed immediately. I told him I'd pay double for the rush. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of peace. That apartment was my sanctuary, a place I had furnished with my own sweat and ambition. Mark had lived there like a king on a throne he didn't build, but by the time he made it back to those doors, his key would be nothing more than a useless piece of metal. I was reclaiming my space, brick by brick, starting with the very door he thought he had the right to walk through. The second call was to a local towing service. I gave them the make, model, and plate number of the silver sedan parked in the studio lot, the car currently registered in my name, the one Mark had been using to play the part of a successful man. I told the dispatcher that the vehicle was being used without my authorization, and I wanted it recovered and moved to a secure location. I thought about him walking out to that parking lot later tonight, expecting to drive away with his new match, in a luxury car that wasn't his, only to find an empty asphalt space. The thought didn't make me sad, it made me feel powerful. The placeholder was no longer providing transportation for the man who had discarded her. The third call was the shortest, but it was the one that would hurt him the most. I called my bank and went through the security prompts with robotic efficiency. I froze every joint account and deauthorized the credit cards he carried in his wallet, the cards he used for his protein shakes, his expensive haircuts, and his nights out with the boys. I watched the access denied status pop up on my banking app and felt a weight lift off my chest. I wasn't just cutting off his money, I was cutting off the oxygen to his ego. He wanted to be a real man for the cameras? Fine. He could start by paying for his own life. I spent the next hour back at the apartment, moving through the rooms like a whirlwind. I didn't linger over memories or cry over old photos. I grabbed heavy-duty black trash bags and began a systematic purge. Every designer shirt I had gifted him for his birthday, every pair of limited edition sneakers I had stood in line for, and every gold watch that was a symbol of my misplaced generosity went into the plastic. I cleared the bathroom of his expensive colognes and the closet of his tailored suits. I was stripping away the costume of the man I had created. When I was finished, I dragged the bags down to the curb. I piled them on the wet pavement, right next to the overflowing trash bins. Looking down at the heap of expensive fabric and leather, I realized that this was all he was, a collection of things I had bought him, wrapped in a personality I had imagined. Everything he owned, everything that made him feel superior, was now sitting on the sidewalk waiting for the morning garbage truck. I walked back upstairs, locked my new deadbolt, and sat in the silence of my own success. The world he thought he was going back to didn't exist anymore. I had dismantled it in 60 minutes, and for the first time in 3 years, I could finally breathe. The clock on the microwave glowed 3:00 a.m., the only light cutting through the absolute stillness of my apartment. I sat on the sofa in the pitch black, the cool screen of my phone illuminating my face as I stared at the live security feed. Outside, the world was silent, but on my screen, the final act of a 3-year tragedy was about to begin. He thought he was walking into a new life, but he was actually walking into a debt he could never repay. I'm about to show you the look on his face when he realized his upgrade didn't come with a roof over his head. If you believe loyalty should never be traded for clout, drop a like right now. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss the next time a secret comes to light. An Uber pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness and splashing against the wet pavement. I watched as Mark stepped out, looking every bit the star he thought he was. He was laughing, tossing his head back with that arrogant confidence, and he reached back to pull the girl in the red dress out of the car. They looked like a couple from a movie, glamorous, successful, and completely oblivious. Mark walked up to the front entrance with a swagger, reaching into his pocket for the key to a home he no longer owned. I watched through the camera lens as he slid the key into the lock. He turned it once, then twice, his brow furrowing in confusion when the mechanism refused to budge. He tried again, jiggling the handle with more force, his laughter dying in his throat. The girl stood behind him, crossing her arms as the chilly night air began to bite. Mark's confusion rapidly spiraled into a visible, frantic panic. He stepped back, looking up at my darkened windows, and then his eyes landed on the curb. The sight of those black trash bags seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He walked toward them slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement, and as he realized what they were, his composure shattered. He saw his designer suits, his sneakers, and his entire identity piled up like yesterday's news. He spun around, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation, and began pounding on the heavy glass door. The sound didn't reach me in the quiet of my living room, but I could see his mouth moving, screaming my name into the empty street. I leaned back against the cushions, watching him through the digital feed, and felt a strange, hollow sensation. I expected to feel anger, or maybe a lingering sting of betrayal, but there was nothing. No heat, no tears, no desire to open that door and hear his excuses. I was watching a stranger have a meltdown over a life he had forfeited the moment he popped that balloon. He was a man who had gambled his found for a fleeting moment of attention, and he had lost. Behind him, the girl in the red dress was no longer smiling. She stood by the trash bags, looking at the heap of clothes and then at the locked door, the realization finally dawning on her. She wasn't looking at a successful man with a bright future. She was looking at a man who had nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and a pile of garbage on a sidewalk. She saw the reality behind the placeholder comment. She saw that his entire existence had been a curated life funded by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. Without a word, she stepped back, looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, and began walking away down the street, leaving him alone with his mess. Mark didn't even notice her leave. He was too busy hurling himself against the glass, his face red and sweating under the streetlights. He looked small. He looked pathetic. I finally reached over and pressed the button on the wall intercom, the static crackling for a second before I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and lower than I expected. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The placeholder is gone, Mark, I said, my words echoing through the speaker on the street. You wanted a real woman and a new beginning? Well, here it is. You're standing in it. Good luck finding someone else to build your life for you, because I'm done being your architect. I released the button before he could respond. I didn't want to hear his voice, his lies, or his hollow apologies. I stood up, the glow of the phone finally fading as I locked the screen. I walked through my quiet, clean apartment, a space that no longer smelled like his cologne or felt crowded by his ego. I reached my bedroom, pulled back the covers, and lay down in the center of the mattress. For 3 years, I had slept on the edge to make room for him. Tonight, I stretched out. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, effortless sleep in a bed and a life that belonged entirely to me. Now that the locks are changed and the placeholder is finally free, I have to ask you something. If you found out your partner was calling you a temporary arrangement behind your back, would you dismantle their life in silence like I did? Or would you have made a scene right there on that stage? Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one tonight.